The day Bruno arrived, the Harrison household buzzed with excitement. Lana, just 3 years old, sat on the porch with wide eyes, her tiny hands clutching her mother's fingers as a large, powerful dog stepped out of the rescue van. Bruno, a retired service dog, had spent years in training and real-life rescue operations. Now, due to a minor injury that ended his active service, he was being placed in a loving home. David and Mia had always admired service dogs, knowing their exceptional intelligence and loyalty. When they heard about Bruno's availability for adoption, they didn't hesitate. They wanted Lana to grow up with a protector, a companion who could keep her safe. Yet, nothing could have prepared them for what Bruno would bring into their lives. As soon as Bruno stepped into their yard, his demeanor was calm but observant. His deep brown eyes scanned his new surroundings, assessing every detail. He moved with precision, each step measured, each glance calculated. But the moment he saw Lana, something shifted. The little girl, fearless and full of curiosity, reached out her tiny hand. Bruno didn't flinch. Instead, he lowered his massive head, allowing Lana to gently pat his fur. "That's it, bud. You're home now," David said, his voice filled with warmth. From that moment, Bruno and Lana were inseparable. He followed her everywhere, his protective instincts kicking in immediately. Even on that first night, Bruno chose to sleep outside her room, his ears alert, his body poised as if waiting for something. Mia and David found it endearing, unaware that this was just the beginning of something extraordinary. Bruno had been in the Harrison household for only a few weeks, but his presence already felt like an inseparable part of their lives. His transition from a highly trained K9 service dog to a family pet was seamless in many ways. He adapted quickly, responding to commands with precision, his discipline evident in every movement. Yet, beneath his calm and loyal demeanor, his instincts had never faded. Unlike ordinary dogs, Bruno had undergone rigorous training as a K9 service dog, specializing in search and rescue operations. He had been trained to detect distress, identify irregular breathing patterns, and sense dangers before they became apparent. Even though he was no longer in active service, that sharp intuition had not diminished. If anything, it had only grown stronger in his new role, not as a working dog, but as Lana's silent guardian. At first, Mia and David simply admired how watchful Bruno was around Lana. If she toddled too close to a sharp-edged table, he would subtly position himself in the way, absorbing the impact instead. When she played in the backyard, Bruno never strayed more than a few feet away, his eyes scanning the perimeter as if expecting a hidden threat. But then, the small things started. At night, when the house was quiet, Bruno wouldn't leave Lana's room. He didn't just rest at her door. He stationed himself beside her crib, ears twitching at the faintest of sounds. He would periodically lower his head to her chest, his nose gently brushing against her as if checking something unseen. Some nights he would whimper softly before repositioning himself, nudging closer as though needing to be right there. David found it adorable at first. "Look at him," he chuckled one evening, glancing at Mia as they watched Bruno through the baby monitor. "He's treating her like his mission now." Mia smiled, though something about Bruno's intensity gave her pause. "It's sweet," she admitted, "but it almost feels like he knows something we don't." It wasn't long before Bruno's behavior escalated. One night, well past midnight, Bruno suddenly leaped onto the bed, startling Mia and David awake. His deep, rumbling growl sent chills down Mia's spine. He wasn't barking at the window or reacting to an outside noise. He was facing the door, ears pinned back, tail stiff. Without hesitation, Bruno jumped off the bed, bolted toward Lana's room, and began scratching at the door. David swung his legs off the bed. "What the?" Bruno barked, a sharp, insistent sound, then let out a distressed whine, his body trembling with urgency. Mia's heart pounded as she threw off the blankets, following behind David as he rushed toward Lana's room. When they opened the door, the sight before them made Mia's blood run cold. Lana was restless, shifting in her sleep, her tiny fists clenching the blanket. Her face, normally rosy and full of life, looked pale under the glow of the nightlight. But what caught Mia's attention, the thing that made her breath hitch, was how Lana's tiny chest barely moved. "She's not breathing right," Mia gasped, rushing to the crib. She placed a shaking hand on Lana's chest. It rose, but shallowly, far too shallowly. Bruno let out a low whimper, pacing anxiously. His head nudged against Lana's side as if urging them to do something. David's hands fumbled for his phone. "Calling 911. Now." Bruno let out another sharp bark, sitting beside Lana as though standing guard. The dispatcher's voice on the other end was calm, but David's panic rose. "Our daughter. She's having trouble breathing," he managed. "Our dog. He woke us up. We wouldn't have noticed." "Stay with her," the dispatcher instructed. "Keep her upright if possible. Help is on the way." Mia scooped Lana into her arms, cradling her close as Bruno pressed his body against her leg, providing warmth and support. Tears pricked at her eyes. Bruno had known. He had sensed something was wrong before they even had a clue. As sirens blared in the distance, Bruno remained perfectly still, his eyes locked onto Lana, his body a shield between her and the unknown danger. The paramedics arrived within minutes, quickly assessing Lana. Bruno remained where he was, watching their every movement with unwavering focus, his training kicking in even now. "She's in respiratory distress," one of the medics said as he placed an oxygen mask gently over Lana's small face. "You got her help just in time." Mia exchanged a horrified glance with David. If Bruno hadn't woken them up, if they had slept through the night. Mia's voice trembled as she stroked Bruno's fur. "He saved her." The medic nodded, a look of recognition in his eyes as he glanced at the dog. "That's a retired K9, isn't it?" David swallowed hard. "Yeah, we adopted him a few weeks ago." "Explains a lot," the medic said, giving Bruno an approving nod. "Service dogs like him, they don't lose their instincts. Even when they're not on duty, they still protect the people they love." Those words settled deep in Mia's heart. That night, as they followed the ambulance to the hospital, Bruno sat by the front door, watching them disappear into the night. His whimper was soft but filled with an understanding only he possessed. Lana was diagnosed with a rare but treatable respiratory condition. Had they not caught it in time, the consequences could have been far worse. When they returned home the next day, exhausted but relieved, Bruno greeted them the only way he knew how, by placing his massive head gently against Lana's tiny form, letting out a low, comforting sound. Lana, though still weak, reached out and gripped his fur with her small fingers. Mia and David exchanged a knowing look. From that moment, Bruno wasn't just their dog. He was their family's silent protector, their guardian, their hero in disguise. And they would never, ever doubt his instincts again. The house was quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. It wasn't the peaceful, comforting quiet that usually settled over their home after Lana drifted off to sleep. Instead, there was a weight in the air, an unshakable tension that neither Mia nor David could fully explain. They had been back from the hospital for a few days, yet every time Mia closed her eyes, she replayed that terrifying night. Bruno's frantic barking, the shallow rise and fall of Lana's chest, the sound of sirens cutting through the darkness. Bruno hadn't left Lana's side since they returned. His movements were measured, his amber eyes filled with a quiet intensity. It was as if he didn't fully trust that the danger had passed. David had noticed it too. "He hasn't been sleeping," he murmured to Mia that evening, watching as Bruno lay beside Lana's crib, his ears twitching at every tiny sound. He just watches her. Mia nodded, concern tightening her chest. She glanced at Bruno, his large frame stretched protectively beside their daughter. Maybe he's still on edge after what happened. David sighed. So am I. Neither of them knew that Bruno was sensing something they couldn't see, something far worse than before. It happened again, this time worse. The night had been uneventful. Lana had fallen asleep without trouble, her soft breathing filling the nursery. Mia and David, exhausted from the past few days, finally allowed themselves to rest. But Bruno didn't. His ears remained perked, his body tense. He lay still, but his breath was uneven, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Then, at exactly 2:43 a.m., he bolted upright. A second later, Bruno let out a deep, guttural growl, a sound so primal that it instantly woke Mia. She sat up with a gasp, gripping David's arm. "Bruno?" David mumbled groggily. Before either of them could process what was happening, Bruno launched himself at their bedroom door, scratching furiously, his nails scraping against the wood. The panic in his movements was undeniable. David didn't hesitate this time. He was already on his feet, heart pounding as he followed Bruno to Lana's room. Mia was right behind him. The moment David threw the door open, time seemed to slow. Lana lay limp in her crib. She wasn't moving. Mia's scream caught in her throat as she rushed forward, her hands shaking as she scooped Lana into her arms. The baby's skin felt cooler than usual, and her tiny lips, oh God, her lips were turning blue. Bruno whined sharply, pressing his nose against Lana's chest. His eyes flicked between Mia and David, urging them to act. David fumbled for his phone. "Calling 911 now!" Mia clutched Lana tightly, her vision blurring with panic. "Stay with me, baby, please, stay with me!" Bruno let out a sharp bark, circling them, his massive body pressed close like he was trying to shield them from the invisible danger. The voice of the emergency operator crackled through the phone. "Ma'am, stay calm. I need you to keep her upright and monitor her breathing." David followed the instructions, his hands unsteady as he placed Lana on her back, watching for any movement. It was faint, too faint. Bruno let out another desperate whimper, nudging Mia's leg. He had known. He had tried to tell them. Mia clutched Bruno's fur. "You saved her again." Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder, faster. Time was slipping away. A silent understanding. The paramedics moved with practiced urgency, their voices calm but firm. Bruno stood unmoving in the corner, his eyes locked on Lana as they worked on stabilizing her. One of the medics, a young woman with kind eyes, glanced at Bruno. "Is that a K9? David nodded numbly. "Retired." She let out a low whistle. "He's the reason she's alive right now." Mia choked back a sob, reaching for Bruno, who immediately pressed his head into her lap. His entire body trembled, not out of fear, but out of sheer relief. One of the paramedics placed an oxygen mask over Lana's tiny face. "Her oxygen levels are stabilizing," he said. "We need to get her to the hospital, but she's going to be okay." David exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair. Bruno leaned against Mia, his weight grounding her, keeping her from falling apart. In that moment, Mia realized something. Bruno wasn't just Lana's protector. He was the glue holding their entire family together. A bond that couldn't be broken. Lana spent 3 days in the hospital under observation. The doctors confirmed that she had an underlying condition that caused intermittent oxygen desaturation episodes, something rare and difficult to detect. If Bruno hadn't acted when he did, they might not have caught it in time. When they finally brought Lana home, Bruno's tail wagged for the first time in days. He greeted them at the door, his massive frame lowered into a gentle bow as he sniffed at Lana, making sure she was okay. Mia crouched beside him, tears slipping down her cheeks as she wrapped her arms around his thick neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Bruno licked her cheek once before turning his attention back to Lana, positioning himself beside her once more. Nothing had changed. He was still her silent guardian, and he always would be. From that day forward, everything was different. Bruno wasn't just a dog in their home. He was part of the medical team, part of their daily routine, part of Lana's safety. He stayed with her during naps, monitored her breathing, and even learned to react when Mia and David checked her oxygen levels, his ears perking up at the sound of the medical device. But more than that, he was her best friend. As the weeks passed and Lana grew stronger, their bond deepened in ways no one could explain. One afternoon, while Mia was making lunch, she overheard soft giggles from the nursery. Peeking inside, she saw Lana holding on to Bruno's fur, using him to steady herself as she took small, uncertain steps. Bruno stood perfectly still, allowing her to lean on him, guiding her gently forward. Mia's chest ached with warmth. She pulled out her phone and pressed record. This wasn't just a moment. It was a testament to everything they had been through together. A little girl and her protector. A bond that had transcended words, time, and even the unspoken boundaries between human and animal. And as she watched Lana laugh, her tiny hands gripping Bruno's fur, Mia knew, no matter what, no matter how many years passed, Bruno would always be there. Her daughter's first guardian, her family's greatest blessing. The days that followed Lana's second hospital visit were a blur of exhaustion, relief, and a profound shift in how Mia and David viewed Bruno. He was no longer just a beloved pet or even a retired K9 service dog. He was something more. He was Lana's guardian, her silent protector, her first and most loyal friend. Even the doctors had marveled at it. "It's rare to see a case caught this early," one specialist had told them. "If it weren't for your dog, it might have gone unnoticed for months." He knew before the medical tests could confirm it. That sentence replayed in Mia's mind every time she saw Bruno next to Lana. Every time he followed her steps, every time he checked on her as she napped, she understood. Bruno's instincts had never left him. But as much as they trusted him now, the challenges weren't over. Bruno wasn't just Lana's protector. He had become the family's living alarm system, always on edge, always ready. And that level of vigilance came at a cost. The third night after Lana returned home, Bruno refused to sleep. Mia woke up to find him pacing the nursery, his eyes never straying from Lana's crib. Even though Lana's breathing was steady, he remained tense, muscles coiled as if expecting something to go wrong. Mia knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "It's okay, boy. She's safe now." Bruno didn't move. His ears flicked, his nose twitched, but he didn't relax. David, standing in the doorway, sighed. "He hasn't let his guard down since we got back. He's exhausted." Mia's voice was soft, full of emotion. "He won't even close his eyes." David crouched beside them, rubbing Bruno's side. "He's doing what he was trained to do." Mia nodded. "But he's not in the field anymore. He's in a home. We have to help him understand that he doesn't have to do this alone." She reached for Lana's baby blanket and draped it over Bruno's back. The dog let out a slow exhale, his body finally shifting slightly. "I think he just needs reassurance," Mia murmured. But deep down, she wondered, was Bruno sensing something they weren't? For a week, things seemed to return to normal. Bruno gradually relaxed. Though he never fully abandoned his post, he at least allowed himself to nap during the day. Lana, now more active than ever, had begun pulling herself up using Bruno as support, giggling as she clung to his fur. It was a sight that made Mia's heart swell with warmth. But then, one night, it happened again. Mia and David had just turned off the lights when Bruno let out a low growl, one that sent ice through Mia's veins. Bruno? David murmured, instantly awake. Bruno didn't move from his spot at the nursery door. His body was rigid, ears pricked forward, tail stiff. Then, a sound, a noise so faint, so subtle, that if not for Bruno, they wouldn't have heard it. A soft wheeze. Mia shot out of bed, heart hammering. "Lana?" They rushed inside just in time to see Lana stirring restlessly, tiny fists curling and uncurling. Her chest rose and fell unevenly, and her lips, though not blue this time, looked paler than usual. Bruno let out another urgent whimper, pressing his nose against Lana's arm. David grabbed the oxygen monitor, his hands shaking as he clipped it onto Lana's finger. The numbers appeared. Too low. David cursed under his breath. "We need to wake her up." Mia scooped Lana into her arms, gently rubbing her back. "Come on, baby. Open your eyes." Lana let out a weak cry, her tiny body shifting as she woke. Her breathing, though still uneven, seemed to stabilize slightly. Mia let out a shaky breath. They had caught it in time. Because of Bruno. Again. She turned to him, eyes shining with unshed tears. "How do you always know?" Bruno simply sat there, his eyes never leaving Lana, his job far from over. The next morning, as the family sat around the kitchen table, Bruno remained by Lana's side, his nose occasionally nudging her, as if making sure she was still okay. Mia ran a hand through her hair, exhaustion clear in her voice. "How does he do it?" David tapped his fingers against the table, deep in thought. "I think it's more than just training. He's bonded to her. He's attuned to her in a way we can't even understand." Mia looked at Bruno, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Then we have to do something for him." That afternoon, Mia and David decided to make a change. Instead of allowing Bruno to carry the weight of responsibility alone, they involved him in Lana's daily routine in a way that made him feel like part of the team, not just a lone guardian. During Lana's medical checkups, Bruno sat beside her, watching the doctors carefully. At night, instead of being the only one watching over her, they reassured him, stroking his fur, letting him know they were there too. They encouraged him to play, to let loose, to be something more than just a protector, and slowly, Bruno began to trust that he wasn't alone. A few days later, as the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, Lana stood shakily, gripping onto Bruno's fur. David had his phone out, recording the moment. Mia held her breath. Then, her first step. Bruno didn't move, didn't shift, didn't flinch. He stayed perfectly still, allowing her to balance. Lana took another wobbly step, then another. Then she stumbled. Bruno instantly caught her, shifting just enough for her to fall safely against him. A small giggle escaped her lips. Mia let out a soft laugh, tears pooling in her eyes. Bruno gently nudged Lana's cheek, his tail wagging ever so slightly for the first time in weeks. David put the phone down, shaking his head with awe. "That's not just training." Mia wiped at her eyes. "No." She reached down, running her fingers through Bruno's thick fur. "That's love." From that day forward, something shifted. Bruno still watched over Lana, but now he knew he wasn't doing it alone. Mia and David trusted him, and he, in turn, learned to trust that they would be there too. One night, as Mia passed by Lana's room, she paused at the doorway. Inside, Lana was curled up with her tiny arms draped over Bruno's back, her face nestled into his fur. Bruno was awake, but this time his body was relaxed. For the first time since coming into their home, he closed his eyes. Mia smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. Bruno had found his purpose, and their family had found something even greater, a love that would last forever. The Harrison household had finally settled into a new rhythm. After weeks of watching over Lana with unwavering vigilance, Bruno had learned to trust his family, to share the responsibility of keeping her safe. He still remained her silent guardian, her steadfast protector, but there was a noticeable difference. He was no longer burdened by the weight of doing it all alone. Mia and David made sure he was involved in every aspect of Lana's care. If she had a medical checkup, Bruno was there, sitting patiently beside her stroller. If Lana struggled with her breathing at night, Bruno stayed close but allowed Mia and David to step in first. Slowly, Bruno had begun to relax, but the universe had one final test for him. A moment that would prove, once and for all, that his place in this family was never just about instinct, but about love. It was a quiet evening, unusually warm for early autumn. The air carried an unsettling stillness, as if the world was holding its breath. David stood on the porch, staring at the horizon. Thick clouds had begun gathering, creeping over the sky like ink spilling across a canvas. A storm was coming. Inside, Mia was settling Lana into her crib, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Bruno sat nearby, watching with calm awareness, his amber eyes tracking every movement. "You're her best friend, you know that?" Mia murmured, running her fingers through his thick fur. Bruno blinked slowly, his version of a quiet affirmation. At precisely 2:58 a.m., the house shook. A deafening crack split the sky, followed by a bone-rattling boom as thunder rolled through the neighborhood. The storm had arrived in full force. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the nursery for a brief moment. The power flickered, then darkness. Bruno was instantly alert. His ears stood up, his body tensed, every muscle coiled like a spring. Then, the sound. A loud thud echoed from somewhere in the house. Bruno let out a low, rumbling growl. Mia stirred in bed. "David," she whispered, nudging her husband. David groaned. "It's just the wind." Bruno barked sharply, his deep voice cutting through the silence. And then, another sound, this time closer. A creaking noise, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the house. Bruno sprang toward the nursery door, his bark turning into a warning snarl. Something was wrong. David threw off the blankets and bolted upright. "Bruno!" Mia felt a shiver of unease slither down her spine. She instinctively reached for the baby monitor, but the screen was black. The power was out. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. Bruno barked again, louder this time, paws scratching against the nursery door. David didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bedside flashlight and rushed toward Lana's room. Mia was right behind him. The air felt thick, charged with something unspoken, something that made Mia's pulse pound in her ears. Then she heard it, a shuffle, right outside the nursery window. Bruno let out a feral growl, the kind that sent chills racing down Mia's spine. She grabbed David's wrist. "Someone's outside!" David froze, his grip tightening around the flashlight. His voice was a whisper. "Stay here." Bruno wouldn't let him go alone. The moment David moved toward the window, Bruno was at his side, his posture rigid, his teeth bared. David pulled back the curtain just in time to see a dark figure retreating into the storm. Lightning flashed again, and for the briefest second, David saw it. A gloved hand pressed against the glass, then gone. "Call 911, David said through clenched teeth. Mia's hands were shaking as she reached for her phone, Bruno still standing protectively in front of Lana's crib. She barely had time to dial before Bruno lunged forward, barking furiously at the window. The figure outside had moved, this time toward the back door. David sprinted down the hall, flashlight beam bouncing against the walls. Bruno didn't hesitate. He bolted after him. David barely made it to the back door before he heard the metallic sound of a lock being tampered with. Bruno lunged forward, paws slamming against the door as a deep, furious snarl tore from his throat. The sound was primal, the kind of warning that no human, no matter their intentions, would dare ignore. Silence. Then, rapid footsteps retreating into the storm. Bruno didn't move. His ears stayed pinned forward, body poised like a coiled spring. The house remained still, except for the distant rumble of thunder. David exhaled shakily. He turned to Bruno, chest heaving. "You saved us!" Bruno didn't need to be told. He already knew. The police arrived 20 minutes later. David explained everything: the power outage, the sounds, Bruno's reaction, the shadow outside the nursery window. One of the officers, a former K9 handler, crouched down, studying Bruno with admiration. "You've got yourself a real protector here," he said. "A lot of dogs would have barked, but this guy, he acted." David ran a hand over his face. "He's always been like that." The officer nodded knowingly. That's the thing about retired K9s. Even when they're off-duty, they're never really off-duty. Mia stood in the doorway, clutching Lana close, tears glistening in her eyes. Bruno padded over to her, sniffing gently at Lana before pressing his head against Mia's leg. He had done his job, but more than that, he had protected his family. The next morning, as the storm cleared and sunlight filtered through the windows, Bruno finally allowed himself to rest. For the first time in days, he curled up beside Lana's crib, exhaling deeply. Mia knelt beside him, running her fingers through his fur. "You can sleep now," she whispered. "We're safe." Bruno blinked at her, then let his head rest against her knee. David stood in the doorway watching them. "We need to do something for him." Mia nodded. "I know." That weekend, the Harrisons made it official. They took Bruno to a special ceremony for retired K9 service dogs, where he was honored for his unwavering loyalty, bravery, and service, not just in his past life, but in his new one. Lana, now strong enough to walk, held onto Bruno's leash as they stood before the crowd. Mia wiped at her eyes as the presenter handed them a medal. "This dog has given everything for his family," the speaker said, voice filled with emotion. "And today, we recognize him not just as a hero, but as a loved one." David placed a hand on Bruno's head. Mia leaned down, her voice thick with love. "Bruno," she whispered, "you're not just our protector. You're family." Bruno wagged his tail. No words were needed. He already knew. Time moved forward, but Bruno's presence remained constant in the Harrison household. He had spent his life as a protector, a silent guardian who watched over his family with unwavering dedication. Lana had grown from a fragile infant into a curious, adventurous toddler, yet even as she gained confidence, Bruno never strayed far from her side. He had become her shadow, her first friend, and her most loyal companion. For Mia and David, Bruno was more than just a pet. He was family. But as the seasons changed, so did Bruno. His once powerful strides became slower, his movements more deliberate. The fire in his amber eyes remained, but his body no longer held the same strength it once did. And as much as they didn't want to admit it, they knew time was catching up to him. It was a particularly cold February night when it happened. Mia woke suddenly, her heart pounding in her chest. At first, she didn't know why. Then she realized. The baby monitor was silent. She sat up, panic creeping in. There were no soft breaths, no rustling blankets, only silence. She bolted from the bed, rushing toward the nursery. But before she could even reach the door, Bruno was already there. He stood in the hallway, his body rigid, his amber eyes locked onto her. But this time, he didn't bark. He didn't panic. He just waited. Mia's breath caught in her throat. Something about the way he stood there, so still, so knowing, made her stomach twist. She pushed open the nursery door and felt her world stop. Lana lay too still in her crib, too quiet. Mia's hands trembled as she reached for her daughter. But just as panic threatened to consume her, Lana took a breath. Shallow, uneven, but there. Tears blurred Mia's vision as she scooped Lana into her arms, pressing her close to her chest. She turned to Bruno, realization washing over her. He had been waiting for her. For the first time in his life, Bruno hadn't acted alone. He had trusted her to come, and that was the greatest lesson of all. As days passed, Mia couldn't shake the weight of that moment. Bruno had spent his life protecting them, but now he had finally let them protect her too. It was as if he had been preparing them for this, teaching them to listen, to trust, to be guardians in their own right. But time was moving forward, and with it, Bruno was slowing down. His steps were heavier, his body more fragile. Yet no matter how tired he was, he never left Lana's side. One quiet evening, Lana, now 5 years old, curled up beside Bruno in the living room. She rested her tiny head against his fur, fingers tangled in his coat. "Bruno's sleepy," she murmured, looking up at Mia. Mia swallowed the lump in her throat, running a hand over Bruno's back. "He's had a big job, sweetheart." Lana nodded, placing a gentle kiss on Bruno's nose. "But he doesn't have to worry, right?" Mia felt her heart ache at the innocence in her daughter's voice. "No, baby," she whispered, stroking Lana's hair. "He doesn't have to worry anymore." Lana smiled softly. "Because we take care of each other." Mia blinked back tears. In that moment, she realized Bruno's love hadn't just protected them. It had changed them. It had taught them how to love without fear, how to protect without hesitation, how to trust that even when the time comes to say goodbye, love never truly leaves. Bruno had spent his life as their guardian, and now his love would live on in them, forever. Bruno's story is not just about a dog's unwavering loyalty. It is a testament to the power of love, trust, and the unbreakable bond between family and their most faithful companion. From the moment he stepped into Lana's life, he was more than just a protector. He was her silent guardian, her first friend, and her greatest teacher. Through every storm, every danger, every silent night where only he could hear the whisper of trouble, Bruno stood strong. Not because he was trained to do so, but because his heart knew no other way. He taught Mia and David the meaning of true protection, not through fear, but through trust. He showed them that love isn't just about keeping someone safe. It's about standing beside them, guiding them, and, when the time comes, trusting them to carry the love forward. Even in his final moments, Bruno's lesson remained. The love he gave, the care he provided, did not vanish when he was gone. It lived on in Lana's kindness, in her instinct to protect those she loved, in the warmth he left behind. Because love like Bruno's doesn't fade, it doesn't disappear. It lingers in the hearts of those lucky enough to have been touched by it, a legacy that time can never erase. And in that, Bruno never truly left. He simply became a part of them, forever.